What brings down an absolute king? Even the greatest kings of the savannah meet their end. Sekekama, the lion who ruled with immense authority, now rested in silence. His story was built not only with strength but also with strategy, like many of the legendary leaders who defined the fate of the Savuti Marsh over the decades. His journey was marked by strength, strategy, and epic battles that shaped the hierarchy of lions in the Savuti Marsh. But his reign didn't end peacefully. He fell in the most brutal way possible, betrayed by those who should have inherited his legacy. What brought this giant to his last breath? Botswana 2014. In the vast landscapes of the Savuti Marsh wilderness, an epic drama was unfolding. Two brothers, Sekekama and Tornnose, emerged from the shadows to claim the southern marsh. With strength and determination, they dethroned the local kings and established their dominance, showing the hyenas who the true rulers were. Thus began one of the most powerful reigns Africa has ever witnessed. But time would take its toll. For years, Sekekama reigned with absolute supremacy. No lion dared challenge his strength, no threat stood against his coalition. But in the wild, even the strongest face an impossible enemy to defeat: age. The signs of weakness appeared, and his own sons noticed. What was once admiration turned into ambition. The king was no longer untouchable, and the succession of power was about to become a bloody territorial conflict. But how did this happen? How was the strongest lion in Africa brought down? And most shockingly, how did Sekekama's own heirs turn against him? What you are about to discover is one of the most brutal chapters of nature, where loyalty has limits, and the throne is conquered by force. Stay with me until the end, because this story will change the way you see nature. Sekekama wasn't just a leader, he was a legend. And his fall was as grand as his reign. Under the relentless savanna sun, Sekekama's figure rose as a symbol of power. His immense size and golden mane made him almost mystical, as if nature itself had shaped him to be king. But the truth behind his greatness was more complex. It was the result of a balance between physical strength and cunning, characteristics that define leadership among lions. While others competed for survival, he reigned with a strategic calm, observing, anticipating, and above all, dominating. With a mane as thick as the twilight shadows and a look that overflowed with authority, he wasn't just another leader. He was the absolute ruler of the Savuti Marsh. Each step he took reverberated across the dry ground, echoing like a silent reminder of who was in charge. The lion hierarchy allowed no doubt, and he was the apex of that pyramid. His name was whispered with respect, fear, and even envy. From his youth, Sekekama proved to be more than just a competitor for survival. He was a born strategist. While other young lions were content to fight over carcasses or small displays of strength, he was already planning his own reign. Every epic battle he faced throughout his life wasn't just a physical confrontation, but a calculated move on the chessboard of succession. And so, without hurry but without hesitation, he became a living legend, shaping the fate of his territory with sharp claws and a cunning mind. The wild demands strength, but Sekekama knew a true king needed something more: intelligence. He didn't dominate just through brutality, but through the wisdom with which he imposed his will. He wasn't the fastest, nor the youngest, but he was, without a doubt, the most feared. He understood the art of war like few others, anticipating attacks and crushing threats before they grew. His reign wasn't won with luck, it was designed with surgical precision, a mix of patience and relentless aggression. Rivals knew that challenging Sekekama was signing their own death warrant. Under his leadership, the coalition he formed became an invincible force, spreading terror among invaders and daring hyenas. The Savuti Marsh wasn't just his home, it was his fortress. A territory where his presence was felt in every mark on the trees, in every roar that echoed at night. But even the grandest empires face challenges, and history always finds a way to test even the most powerful. Time, however, is a relentless enemy, which no king can avoid. Sekekama had conquered everything: territory, lionesses, respect, and a lineage. But in the silence of the early mornings, something began to creep into his mind. Age and weakness would come for everyone. Sekekama was no longer the young lion who had conquered the lands with ease. Experience still burned in his eyes, but, like everything in nature, even the fiercest of kings begins to feel the weight of time. His strength, once invincible, was now tempered by age, and the reality that each day could be another challenge to maintain his leadership. And in the Wild Kingdom, weakness is an invitation for a territorial dispute. In the shadow of his absolute rule, new forces were starting to stir. Among those who walked under his protection, some were no longer satisfied with just following. They were young, full of ambition, and royal blood ran through their veins. The very same rebellious sons he once protected now watched from afar, waiting. Sekekama had taught them everything about strength and power, but was he ready to face the consequences of his own legacy? Sekekama wasn't born a king, he became one. In a time where the lion hierarchy was dictated by brute force and cunning, he needed to prove he deserved every bit of the Savuti Marsh. Alongside his brother, Torn-Nose, Sekekama watched the local leaders govern with authority, but also with exposed weaknesses. The succession of power in the wild doesn't forgive hesitation, and he knew the right moment would come. All it took was patience, strategy, and the precise blow. The year was 2014 when the opportunity appeared. The kings of the region, once untouchable, began to show signs of wear. Sekekama and Torn-Nose didn't hesitate. In a coordinated attack, they challenged the old rulers and, in an epic battle that swept the heart of the savannah, they overthrew them. The roar of victory echoed among the twisted trees, and in that moment, Sekekama took for himself not just a territory, but a legacy. He was no longer a challenger. He was the new dominant lion, and his rise would change everything. The Savuti Marsh had been conquered, but maintaining dominance was a constant challenge. Rivals appeared from all directions, wandering lions, rival coalitions, and even hyenas, testing the limits of his power. In this territory, every roar was more than a threat. It was a reminder that, in nature, supremacy is always temporary, and the throne is never safe. Sekekama, however, wasn't a king who tolerated disorder. With ruthless tactics, he hunted down and eliminated invaders, spreading terror among those who dared question his reign. His attack strategy was simple: anticipate, destabilize, and destroy. He didn't just protect his territory, he expanded it, consolidating himself as the unquestioned ruler of the region. But a king doesn't rule alone. To ensure his lineage, Sekekama needed strong and loyal lionesses. Over the years he formed a powerful harem, fathering sons who carried his blood and his fury. Some said he chose his mates like he chose his battles, with strategic vision. He knew it wasn't enough just to produce offspring. It was necessary to mold them to be worthy of continuing his legacy. But in the kingdom of lions, sons don't always follow in their father's paw prints. The years of reign brought countless victories but also new challenges. Sekekama was at his peak and few dared to confront him directly. But nature has its own rules, and an empire is never truly safe. Rivals emerge from the shadows, alliances crumble, and even within the family itself, loyalty can be a fickle thing. The swamp that Sekekama ruled hid not only prey and hunters but also secrets that threatened the balance of his reign. Time continued to march on, and with it, the challenges multiplied. Every battle won was another scar, a reminder that even supreme kings one day feel the weight of the crown. But Sekekama wasn't ready to give in yet. He had fought to conquer all of that, and he would fight even harder to maintain his dominance. Sekekama, like any great leader, always knew that the greatest danger didn't just come from external forces. But what he couldn't predict was that, in the very darkness of his kingdom, a new threat was forming. A threat that would challenge not only his strength but the very foundation of his empire. Sekekama's leadership was never peaceful. Being the dominant lion of the Savuti Marsh meant facing enemies in every direction, and he knew that any sign of weakness could cost him his reign. From the moment he took the throne, war became part of his routine. Rivals would emerge from time to time, challenging his authority, but they all fell before his relentless strength. Every confrontation was a spectacle of brutality and strategy, where Sekekama didn't just win, he crushed any doubt about who the true king was. The territorial conflicts weren't just against other lions. Hungry hyenas prowled his lands, testing the limits of his domain. But Sekekama didn't tolerate provocations. With an overwhelming roar and precise attacks, he and his coalition imposed absolute respect. The jackals of the savannah knew that the swamp wasn't safe territory for scavengers. When he patrolled his borders, silence fell. His enemies learned quickly. Defying Sekekama was signing their own death warrant. Even with the advancing years, Sekekama didn't back down. In 2021, when many believed his reign was beginning to weaken, he proved otherwise. Makalo, leader of the River Kings, emerged as a real threat. Younger and full of ambition, Makalo believed Sekekama's age was his greatest weakness. But what he didn't know was that experience and strategy could overcome youth and vigor. When the two collided in fierce combat, the epic battle unfolded under the watchful eyes of the savannah. The fight was brutal. The ground shook under the weight of the giants who dueled for power. Sekekama, despite being older, showed that he still had the heart of a true warrior. He not only resisted Makalo's attacks, but returned them with a precision that only a veteran of countless wars could have. In the end, Makalo fell, defeated, and humiliated. The territory of the River Kings now belonged to Sekekama, proving that his reign was not yet near its end. But not every victory comes without a price. The battle against Makalo left deep marks. Wounds took longer to heal, tiredness became more present, and the first signs of wear and tear began to appear. Sekekama felt the weight of the years, even though he never showed it. However, the watchful eyes of his own lineage began to notice. His sons, once mere spectators of his greatness, now saw an opportunity. And in the wild, a king cannot afford to show vulnerability. The question hanging in the air was unavoidable. How long could Sekekama keep his crown? The Savuti Marsh was vast, but his influence was beginning to be tested not only by external enemies, but by those who carried his own blood. On the horizon, the shadows of rebellion began to take shape, and Sekekama did not yet know that the greatest challenge of his life would not come from outside, but from within his own family. For years, Sekekama reigned as an absolute titan, a dominant lion whose strength seemed inexhaustible. But time, relentless as always, began to take its toll. The scars that were once symbols of glorious battles became reminders of a body that no longer recovered as before. His movements, still powerful, became a little slower. Small details, almost imperceptible to an inattentive eye, but clear to those who lived with him. The Savuti Marsh felt the change, and so did his sons. The lion hierarchy offers no room for weakness. In the wild, a leader is not allowed to grow old in peace. Sekekama always knew this. However, denying the signs was useless. Hunts became more challenging, and battles demanded an effort that once seemed natural. His roars remained firm, but they no longer carried the same impressiveness. And more worrying than that, the way his own coalition observed him began to change. The admiration still existed, but now it was accompanied by a new emotion: impatience. The external enemies noticed the change, but it was his own sons who reacted first. Raised under the shadow of one of the greatest kings of the savannah, they learned early on that power is not inherited, it is conquered. And when they began to notice hesitations in their father, something awakened within them. Respect remained, but submission was no longer absolute. Some tested the limits, provoking small disputes, as if assessing whether the throne truly still belongs to the old monarch. Tension filled the air. Sekekama, always attentive, noticed the exchanged glances, the challenges disguised as play. One of his sons, bolder than the others, made a mistake that would change everything. He tried to mate with one of the lionesses of the coalition. A gesture of affront, a silent declaration that the old king was no longer unquestionable. Sekekama responded in the only way possible, with brutality. The young lion was expelled, and along with him, 3 other brothers who were already rehearsing their own insubordination. The Savuti Marsh, which had always been a symbol of stability under Sekekama's rule, now harbored a silent conflict. Sekekama's sons, once loyal and observant, began to act strangely. Instead of leaving the territory as expected, they remained nearby, in the shadows, studying their father's every move. In nature, it is not uncommon that, when leadership weakens, the heirs observe in silence, waiting for the moment when succession will be inevitable. Sekekama's kingdom was about to face a new threat, not from outside, but from the very lineage he had created. It was a patience game, and they knew time was on their side. Sekekama had shown his strength, but also his vulnerability, and for ambitious young lions that was all they needed to plan their next move. The presence of these exiled young lions was like a storm forming on the horizon. They were not just rejected sons, they were potential heirs, trained by the king himself, knowledgeable of every corner of that territory. And more importantly, they had a motivation that no external rival possessed. They wanted more than territory. They wanted to prove they were worthy of usurping their own father's throne. But the question was, when would they make their move? And more importantly, would Sekekama be ready to face them? Being Sekekama's son meant growing up under the shadow of one of Africa's greatest lions. From a young age, the young princes learned that the wild gives no privileges, not even to a king's descendants. Every step they took, every move they tried to make was observed with critical eyes, and over time something began to change within them. Respect for their father still existed, but there was a truth impossible to ignore. The king was getting old, and the succession of power would not happen without a fight. The final break came when one of the sons, overcome by instinct and ambition, committed an unforgivable act. He tried to mate with one of the lionesses of the coalition, a direct challenge to Sekekama's authority. No leader could allow that, and the punishment was merciless. Sekekama, even feeling the weight of his years, expelled the young rebel with brutality, making it clear that his position was not yet in dispute. But the spark of revolt had already been lit, and where there's fire, there's imminent destruction. 3 other brothers followed the exiled one, forming their own coalition. Now, they were nomads in their own land, stripped of the right to belong to the kingdom they helped build. But instead of leaving, they decided to stay close. They knew every trail of the Savuti Marsh, every hiding place, every strategic point that one day could be useful. They didn't just want a territory, they wanted to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs, and for that, they just needed to wait for the right moment. Sekekama knew they were still there, hidden among the shadows of the savannah. They weren't like any other group of exiled youngsters. They were his own sons, raised under his teachings, knowledgeable of his tactics. He couldn't underestimate them, but he also couldn't attack them without reason. For now, they were just ghosts haunting his borders. But the real danger of ghosts is that they always come back to haunt the past. The savannah was now divided. On one side, Sekekama, the legendary king still on the throne, still feared. On the other, 4 young lions full of vigor, impatient and thirsty for a chance. It was only a matter of time before this territorial conflict turned into something much bigger. The exiled lions needed an opening, a moment of weakness to attack, and fate would deliver exactly that to them. Meanwhile, a new danger was approaching Sekekama's territory. 2 nomad lions, attracted by the scent of challenge, invaded his lands in search of dominance. Once again, the old king would have to fight. But, this time, the battle wasn't just against unknown enemies, it was also against time itself. His body didn't respond like it used to, the wounds took a long time to heal, and any sign of weakness could be the trigger for his sons to start the coup they had been waiting for. The morning breeze carried a strange scent in the air, a scent that Sekekama immediately recognized. Intruders. 2 nomad lions had crossed the borders of the Savuti Marsh, guided by the scent of opportunity. They weren't inexperienced youngsters, but they weren't established kings either. They were survivors, warriors forged by necessity, ready to risk everything for a fertile territory full of prey. And what better than to challenge a monarch whose reign was already showing signs of decline? Sekekama didn't hesitate. Even with age weighing on his muscles, he was still the dominant lion, and abandoning his post without a fight was never an option. With his mane darkened by time and the cold stare of someone who has faced countless battles, he went to the confrontation. The nomads tried to test his resistance, surrounding him, looking for weak points, but the old king knew all the strategies. He wasn't just brute force, he was experience, intelligence, and above all, a lion who would never accept defeat without a high price. Sekekama's roar echoed through the savannah, a clear warning that it wasn't yet time for his downfall. The first nomad advanced, attempting a quick strike, but was met with a brutal response. The old king's claws ripped through the air and dug into the invader's flank, drawing a cry of pain. The second lion hesitated for an instant, and that instant was all Sekekama needed. With a swift movement, He lunged at his opponent, knocking him down with the weight of his massive body. Experience had triumphed over youth. The battle wasn't quick, nor easy. Sekekama emerged victorious, but not unharmed. During the fight, a treacherous blow from one of the nomads hit his hind paw, leaving a deep wound. The pain radiated with every step, a cruel reminder that times were changing. He had won again, but at what cost? Blood stained the ground of the Savuti Marsh, and it wasn't just from the invaders. The king, even triumphant, had been wounded, and this detail would not go unnoticed. The news spread quickly. The nomads had been defeated, but Sekekama was hurt. The scent of the king's blood mixed with the wind, carrying a silent message to those waiting in the shadows. His sons, exiled and full of ambition, now had something they never had before, a real advantage. They wouldn't need brute force to dethrone him. They just had to wait for time itself to do its work. And for the first time in his life, Sekekama felt the weight of this truth. The king was still standing, but for how long? His sons were certainly asking themselves the same thing, and they weren't the type to let opportunities slip away. They had a plan, they had patience, and above all, they had a single goal: to overthrow the one who once expelled them. And now, with Sekekama injured, the hour of revenge was closer than ever. The wound on Sekekama's paw was more than a physical problem. It was a sign, a silent warning for those who knew how to interpret it. And his sons knew. Since they were expelled, they had been waiting for a moment like this. They couldn't just face the king head-on. He was still a living legend, even weakened. So instead of attacking directly, they decided to use something Sekekama knew well: strategy. The coalition of four brothers began to approach the borders of the Savuti Marsh, not as invaders, but like shadows, always lurking. During the night, their roars echoed in the distance, disturbing the sleep of the lionesses and cubs. During the day, they left marks throughout the territory, footprints that Sekekama recognized. They were not strangers, they were his own descendants, sending a message. The old king was beginning to understand. He wasn't just injured, he was being hunted. The sons' plan was clear: to wear him down little by little. They were not in a hurry. Sekekama was at a disadvantage, and each passing day was one less day for him, and one more for his heirs. First, they surrounded the territory, making hunting difficult. Then they began to interfere whenever he tried to rest, appearing just enough to force him to get up, to move, to expend energy. Small provocations, constant, relentless. And Sekekama felt the impact. Before, it was he who dictated the rhythm of the Savuti Marsh, who established the rules. Now he was reacting to the movements of others. That was unacceptable. But he couldn't afford to act without caution. With each attack, he noticed how his sons were more organized, more patient. They had learned from the best, and now they were using that knowledge against him. But Sekekama was no ordinary lion. If his sons were using strategy, he would too. He began to change his habits, appearing where he wasn't expected, hunting at different times, avoiding direct confrontations. If they wanted to test patience, he would test theirs. And for a while, it worked. But the problem with psychological warfare is that it only takes one mistake for everything to fall apart. And that mistake was coming soon. A moment of vulnerability, a lapse in attention, a moment when Sekekama would be alone. It was all the coalition needed. They knew they couldn't postpone it for much longer. The old king's reign was already hanging by a thread, and the succession of power was about to be decided the only way the wild knows how: in blood. Darkness covered the Savuti Marsh when Sekekama's fate was finally sealed. His sons, who had spent weeks testing his patience and draining his strength, knew the time had come. The coalition could wait no longer. The old king was still a fearsome opponent, but he was injured, tired, and now alone. It was the perfect moment to claim the throne. The ambush was carefully planned, and Sekekama didn't even realize the danger until it was too late. The first attack came stealthily. One of the sons emerged from the shadows, roaring in challenge, forcing Sekekama to react. Even weakened, the dominant lion advanced, ready to fight as he always had. But this was no ordinary fight. While he focused on the first attacker, the other three approached from the sides, moving like patient predators. When Sekekama finally realized, he was already surrounded. The strategy was complete. The old king fought. He fought as he always fought, with the fury of one who has already won impossible battles. He knocked down one of his sons, momentarily scared off another, but the math was cruel. 4 against 1. His blows no longer had the same impact as before. His breathing was heavy, his paws no longer moved with the same agility. Time, which was once his ally, now worked against him, and his sons knew it. They attacked in turns, avoiding direct confrontation for too long. One would bite, then retreat. Another would advance from behind, strike, and flee before the response. Sekekama tried to react, but each movement became slower. Blood began to stain his already aging mane, and for the first time the savannah saw its king falter. The final blow came without glory, without honor, without the respect he once commanded. One of the sons jumped on him, sinking his fangs into his throat. Sekekama resisted, but the strength of 4 lions was too much even for the greatest of them all. And then, silence. The dominant lion, the one who ruled Savuti with claw and intelligence, fell before those he himself brought into the world. His sons watched him, panting, but there was no celebration. The death of a leader was not just the end of a reign, it was the beginning of a new era, and for them, the question was not just who won, but what comes next. Because the wild never sleeps, and the Savuti Marsh is never without a king for long. Sekekama's body lay on the land he ruled for so many years. Around it, the savannah seemed to hold its breath, as if even the winds respected the moment. There was no party, no celebration. His sons, now the new leaders, just stood there, watching their fallen father, feeling the weight of what they had just done. The most feared reign of the Savuti Marsh was coming to an end, but what would come next was still unknown. In his final months, Scarface was no longer seen with the females or fighting for his territory. He wandered the savannah alone, walking slowly, as if saying goodbye to everything he once owned. Even without his former strength, his gaze still carried the weight of a glorious past. For the guides and tourists, lucky enough to see him in these final days, it was like watching the last act of a living legend. He was still Scarface, the lion who survived everything and everyone. Unlike so many kings who fell to the violence of the wild, Scarface met his end in a rare way. In June of 2021, he lay down under a tree and never got up. There were no roars of pain, no desperate fight for life. He simply rested, surrendering to the fate no lion can avoid. His body was found at peace, as if he knew his journey was complete. His reign was over, but his name would never be forgotten. News of his death traveled the world quickly. Researchers, photographers, and wildlife lovers mourned the loss of the one who became a symbol of the resilience and majesty of lions. For many, Scarface wasn't just a wild animal. He represented the struggle, the survival, and the grandeur of nature in its purest form. He had become immortal, not in body, but in the memory of all who followed him throughout the years. The savannah, once the stage for his battles and conquests, now felt his absence. The circle of life continued. New kings would rise, new prides would rule the territory. But no other lion would have the story that Scarface had. His scar, his strength, and his journey would remain as an eternal legacy. Even after death he remained a legend. The lion who marked an era, the Scarface who defied time. Even in death he remained a legend. The lion who marked an era, Scarface, who defied time. But is his story really over? Or does Scarface in some way still live in the shadows of the echo at night, in the silent respect other lions feel when they step on the territory that was once his? Some legends never die, they just wait to be told again. Scarface lived like a legend and died like a king. His reign lasted an impressive 14 years, extremely rare for a male lion. From the bloody battles that marked his rise to his final moments on the savannah, his story has been recorded as one of the greatest epics of wildlife. Now the question remains, who will be the next great king of the savannah? The cycle never stops, new lions emerge, prides form, and territories change hands. But one thing is certain, Scarface will never be forgotten. His name echoes as one of the greatest symbols of the wild. Now I want to hear from you. If you could choose a single moment to define Scarface's greatness, what would it be? Do you think any other lion will be able to repeat his accomplishments? Comment below. If you like this video and want to see more amazing stories like this one, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell and give it a thumbs up. See you in the next video.